A flight attendant tried to push a family stroller down the jet bridge, but when the father stepped in, the entire bridge shook with the power of his intervention. A white passenger kicked a black CEO's baby during boarding. Thinking no one would dare confront him, he didn't realize the father's response would send him straight into an emergency seat he never wanted. The moment that cry echoed, the cabin's balance of power flipped. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The man behind him muttered again. Dr. Marvin Caldas didn't flinch. He stood at Gate 32, holding his boarding pass in one hand and his 8-month-old son, Leron, snugly secured to his chest in a gray and blue travel carrier. The hum of the terminal buzzed behind him. Conversations, luggage wheels, a distant boarding call, but the sound that cut through it all was the impatient tapping of Brodenvale's foot on the hollow metal floor. "Any day now," Broden murmured again, just loud enough to escape being technically confrontational. Marvin tilted his head slightly, not turning, not reacting, but fully aware. He had encountered men like this before, those who believed their irritation justified everything. But this was not the moment to engage. Instead, he adjusted Leron's blanket gently, whispering, "Just a few more minutes, little one. We'll be in the air soon." The gate agent scanned Marvin's pass with a mechanical beep, not even meeting his eyes. The overhead cameras rotated with their usual, sterile precision, and somewhere in the ceiling, a red dot blinked rhythmically, recording everything. Marvin took a calm step forward onto the jet bridge, the soles of his shoes echoing lightly on the metal walkway. It was a sound he knew well from years of travel, but this time it sounded different, more hollow, more watchful. Behind him, Broden handed over his own pass with a curt, "Finally." As Marvin continued down the corridor, the air thickened, not physically but with something else. Tension, unspoken, unjustified. He could feel it in the way Broden's footsteps landed a bit harder than necessary, trailing him like a complaint that hadn't yet found its voice. Leron stirred slightly, letting out a soft, contented breath against his father's chest. Marvin smiled. This trip had been carefully planned, not for leisure, not for some PR stunt, but to visit the engineers in Terranport who had begun field testing Aerolon Systems' new aero safety engine. The project meant something to him, but more than that, flying with Leron meant proving that dignity didn't have to be checked with the baggage. Halfway down the bridge, the hum of the plane's idling engines grew louder, vibrating through the metal flooring. Marvin stopped briefly, adjusting the strap on Leron's carrier to redistribute the weight. The baby's small hand brushed his collarbone, a gesture so small, yet grounding. Then he heard it, Broden's breath, sharp and close behind. Not a word, but a sigh laced with judgment. "You could have checked that thing at the gate," Broden grumbled louder now. Marvin turned halfway, his tone even. "He's not luggage." Broden gave a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't say he was. Just saying some of us paid extra for peace and quiet." There it was, the first true spark. Marvin studied him, broad shoulders hunched forward, jaw tight, eyes scanning for agreement that wouldn't come. He wore entitlement like a suit jacket, not overtly aggressive but always ready to feign victimhood if challenged. "I'm not here to disturb anyone," Marvin replied calmly. "Just getting to my seat." "Let's hope it stays that way," Broden muttered. They reached the aircraft door. A faint gust of recycled air escaped as it opened, and with it came the familiar pressure change that made Leron shift again. Marvin instinctively cupped the back of his son's head with one hand and stepped onto the aircraft. As the threshold passed under him, so did something else, an invisible line. One he wouldn't realize until much later had been the last line of calm. The aisle ahead was cramped, passengers adjusting bags, flight attendants calling out instructions, overhead bins slamming shut. But even in that minor chaos, Marvin felt it again, that sense of being watched not with concern, but suspicion. A man traveling alone with a baby. Black, composed, clearly professional, but still watched. He moved down the aisle with practiced grace, each step deliberate, each glance calculated not to provoke. Broden followed a few steps behind, but now the gap between them had become charged. Every movement of Marvin adjusting the carrier, every coup from Laron, became, in Broden's eyes, a disruption. Marvin reached his seat, front cabin, left side, row 3. He secured his bag, checked the seatbelt extender for the carrier, and settled in. He glanced down at Laron, who blinked up at him with the calm of someone who had no idea what strangers were capable of. Then, from behind, the final clue came. Not loud, not direct, but unmistakable. Broden, still standing, stared at the seat assignment. Row 4, directly behind. "You've got to be kidding," he said under his breath. Marvin didn't turn around. He had no desire to escalate something that shouldn't have started, but he now understood the stakes. This flight would not be silent, not for lack of sound, but because of a different kind of noise, the noise of judgment, assumption, and entitlement. The engines outside shifted in tone, signaling the beginning of pre-flight checks. A flight attendant moved past quickly, offering routine glances and checklist nods. Nothing about this moment stood out to the crew. Nothing signaled a warning to them. But Marvin knew better. He didn't know Broden's name. He didn't know the man's breaking point, but he knew how thin the walls were that held some men's patience together. He held Laron a little closer, pressing the baby's head gently against his chest. The infant yawned, eyes fluttering shut. Marvin looked forward, expression steady, voice silent, thoughts racing. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew how fast calm could break. He'd seen it before, in boardrooms, in terminals, in the world. And here, on a flight that should have been simple, should have been routine, that quiet knowledge settled in his bones like a second heartbeat. The red exit sign flickered briefly as the aircraft doors sealed. He had no idea that the walk down the jet bridge would be the last calm step of the day. Marvin's shoulder grazed the seat edge as he stepped into the aircraft, the narrow aisle squeezing past him like a hallway made of elbows and overlapping voices. The moment he entered, it was clear something in the air wasn't right. The usual quiet efficiency of boarding felt off-kilter, as if the cabin was holding its breath. Passengers shuffled and twisted, reaching overhead, murmuring too loud for comfort, as if hoping that noise would make the space feel bigger than it was. A flight attendant approached, Taryn Hest, late 30s, tall, wiry, with a badge slightly crooked on his chest and a schedule bleeding through his eyes. He smiled at Marvin, or tried to. "Sir, need a hand with the—" he asked, already leaning toward the strap of the infant carrier, but his voice drifted halfway into a call for a blanket down the row. Marvin offered a polite nod, adjusting the strap with one hand and shifting the weight of his son, Laron, with a practiced motion. "We're good, thank you," he said gently. Taryn nodded absently, already glancing elsewhere, the tension in his shoulders tight as wire. Behind them, a sharp scrape of shoes struck the cabin floor. Broden Vale forced his way past two passengers fumbling with a duffel bag, his muttered, "Unbelievable," slicing through the soft cabin noise like a box cutter. His eyes locked briefly on Marvin, then dropped to the infant against his chest, and then back up with a twitch of barely hidden frustration. He had hoped for quiet. He had planned for control. And this, to him, was neither. Marvin didn't catch the glare in full, only a flicker. He was focused on maneuvering into his assigned seat, 3A, just beside the window, where he could lean back, rock Laron if needed, and keep to himself. His goal was simple: avoid disruption, stay unnoticed, keep Laron calm, and complete the trip with dignity intact. But Broden's mind twisted around a different axis. The baby was noise waiting to happen. The father was an interruption before it had even begun. And the front section, his preferred sanctuary, was now, in his mind, compromised. Broden slid into 3B with more force than necessary, thumping his bag beneath the seat, elbowing the armrest down like it owed him something. His knee bounced once, then again, then faster. He glanced at Laurent, then away, then back, already building a story in his head, one where he was the victim of inconsideration. Dramatic irony pressed in from all sides. Marvin believed the worst was behind him. Broden believed the worst was beginning. Only one of them would be proven right. Taryn moved down the aisle, checking belts, adjusting tray tables, all while missing the small storm beginning to form in row 3. Jarek Dorn, a man in his early 40s with sharp eyes and a calmer manner, watched from across the aisle in 4C. A quiet observer by nature, Jarek had already picked up on the atmosphere shift. He'd seen enough flights to know when tension wasn't random. His hand slid into his bag, casually pulling out his phone. Not to message, not yet, but to keep ready. Sometimes, he thought, it's better to be filming when nobody else is. Marvin adjusted Laurent's blanket, smoothing it gently along the baby's side as the first chime rang out, cabin doors secured. It was a clean sound, high-pitched and light, but in Broden's ears it echoed like a door closing on his right to peace. He looked toward the window, then back toward the carrier, as if trying to decide whether to speak now or hold the grudge in silence. He chose the latter, at least for now, but his fingers curled tighter around the armrest and his jaw tightened in a rhythm too controlled to be healthy. Marvin whispered softly to Laurent, who made no sound except for a sleepy breath. "We're almost there, little one," he murmured. His voice was low, warm, measured, not because anyone asked for silence, but because he'd learned that calm fed calm. He noticed Broden's movements in the periphery but gave them no weight. Probably just someone having a rough day, he told himself. But Jarek noticed the way Broden kept looking. Not at Marvin, at the baby. The plane lurched slightly as the pushback began. Flight attendants snapped into routine, securing carts and checking belts again. Taryn passed one last time by row 3 and nodded mechanically. "We'll be airborne soon," he said, missing the flare of impatience in Broden's eyes as he spoke. Broden closed his eyes briefly, inhaling as if trying to will the baby out of existence. The carrier, tucked neatly and responsibly in Marvin's lap, didn't move. Laurent didn't cry. Nothing had happened yet, nothing tangible. But inside Broden, the storm had begun. A silent argument formed in his head. About space, about noise, about fathers who brought infants into premium zones and thought kindness excused inconvenience. He hadn't said a word out loud. Not yet. Jarek's thumb hovered over the red record button on his screen. The aircraft shifted again, taxiing toward the runway. Marvin adjusted the seatbelt around himself and Laurent, carefully checking the restraint straps with quiet precision. He glanced once toward Broden, saw the bouncing knee, the flexing jaw, the stare that refused to settle, and he understood something. Not fully, but enough. This was not just about preference or discomfort. This was about control. And Marvin was an obstacle. Laurent stirred slightly, his head nuzzling into Marvin's chest. A soft sigh escaped the baby's mouth, barely audible. Yet Broden flinched as if the cabin had been pierced by a siren. He leaned forward, muttered just loud enough, "Control your kid." Marvin turned his head slowly. His voice was calm. "He's asleep," he said. No anger, just fact. Broden said nothing back, but the message had been sent in both directions. One of tension, one of warning. The second chime sounded, final cabin check complete. The engine hum deepened into a low roar. Outside, the airport blurred past the windows. Inside, a different acceleration had already begun, one not powered by jet fuel, but by resentment, ignorance, and a father's silent vow to protect without violence. Jarek locked his screen but kept the camera ready. And as the aircraft lifted off, pressing everyone gently into their seats, The silence between Marvin and Broden stretched into something invisible but heavy, like wires drawn too tight across a steel frame. One more twitch, one more breath wrong, and it would snap. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled into stillness, and the final sentence arrived, as true in silence as it was in sound. The air tightened as if the cabin itself sensed what none of the men were willing to admit. "Control your kid," Broden Vale muttered sharply, his voice low but edged with an unmistakable hostility. Marvin Caldas lifted his gaze from his son, blinking once, slowly. The cabin lights had just dimmed after takeoff, casting the interior in soft, amber, and cool shadows. The engine's steady roar filled the silence, but in that moment it was Broden's words that cut through. Laron had not cried. He had not whimpered. He had merely shifted in his carrier, curling slightly as the pressure adjusted in the cabin, his only sound a barely audible exhale. But to Broden, it might as well have been a siren. Marvin stared at him for a moment, calm but alert, a quiet narrowing of the eyes that carried more weight than any raised voice. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached down to gently pat Laron's back, whispering in that same rhythmic cadence he always used to settle him. The infant, nestled tightly against Marvin's chest, remained serene, his breathing shallow and content. Around them, passengers leaned into books, headsets, and sleep, but a tension had formed that only a few sensed clearly. Jarek Dorn, seated across the aisle, slowly tilted his phone upright again. He had noticed Broden's shifting earlier, the way his hands clenched the armrest too tightly, how his knee bounced even when no turbulence stirred. Jarek had seen moments like this escalate before, and something in his gut told him that this one would. Broden leaned back stiffly, jaw clenched, eyes fixated on the seat in front of him. His thoughts were spinning. He had chosen this flight for peace, for the quiet needed before a tense merger presentation. And now, an infant, seated 2 rows ahead, flanked by a father who appeared too calm for Broden's unraveling expectations. The injustice felt personal, though it wasn't. Every breath, every soft shuffle from the child grated at Broden's nerves like static in a signal he couldn't silence. In his mind, he had already labeled Marvin negligent, inconsiderate, despite no evidence of either. Marvin, meanwhile, had begun quietly scanning, not just Broden, but the passengers surrounding them. He noted an older gentleman adjusting his hearing aids 2 seats down, a college student sleeping with her hoodie pulled over her eyes, 2 middle-aged men discussing a project proposal in hushed tones behind him. No one else had reacted to Broden's remark? Yet. But the silence was thickening, and Marvin felt it rising around them like fog. The overhead sign blinked quietly, seatbelts on. Taryn Hest, the flight attendant, walked the aisle with a clipboard and forced professionalism. As he passed by Broden, he barely glanced, too distracted to notice the stare Broden threw toward Marvin again, sharper this time, lips pressed into a thin line of contempt. Marvin shifted Laren slightly, adjusting the strap on his carrier, when Broden let out a loud sigh and smacked the side of his own armrest with the heel of his palm. It wasn't loud enough to draw attention from the back rows, but Jarek caught it. He tapped his screen. Recording. "I paid for a quiet seat," Broden said suddenly, louder than necessary. His voice was still low, but it carried an artificial calm that made it worse. "This isn't what I expected." Marvin didn't turn fully, but his head angled just enough to acknowledge the statement without inviting a debate. "Then perhaps you should have booked a private cabin," he said softly. Broden froze. His mouth parted slightly, unsure if it had been sarcasm or simply reason. Either way, it hit harder than a retort would have. He looked down at his shoes, then at the base of Marvin's seat, where a tiny portion of Laron's carrier barely overlapped the invisible boundary of foot space. That was it. That was the trigger. In Broden's eyes, it wasn't just a carrier, it was intrusion, disrespect, a threat to his control. He crossed his arms and leaned back, the plastic of his seat creaking as he shifted his weight. But inside, he boiled. Every hum of the engine, every coo from the infant, and every ounce of Marvin's restraint only made him feel more powerless. His thoughts turned darker. He imagined scenarios, brief, irrational flashes, where he said something that would make the father back down, or did something to make him move. But reason flickered only briefly before being swallowed by that irrational storm. In contrast, Marvin's focus was unwavering. Liron shifted again, his tiny hands curling gently against his father's chest. Marvin checked his pulse, steady as ever. The hum of the engine masked all but the most distinct sounds. Yet to Broden, even the sound of fabric rustling seemed louder than it should. Taran returned up the aisle, checking latches and tray tables. He paused near their row and asked without looking, "Everything good up here?" Broden said nothing. Marvin nodded once. "Good," Taran muttered and walked on. As the attendant moved past, Broden leaned slightly forward again, eyes narrowed. "You think just because you've got a baby on your chest you can do whatever you want," he said, this time not bothering to lower his voice. Marvin turned this time, fully. His voice was cool and level, but now each word was deliberate. "I think," he said, "that my son has done nothing wrong, and neither have I." Broden scoffed, looking away. Jarek kept recording. There was no outburst, no confrontation yet. But the pressure was building, invisible but undeniable. The silence that followed didn't calm anyone. It deepened the divide. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't peace. It was pause, tension between beats, like the final moment before a conductor's baton strikes and everything erupts. And in that silence, Marvin knew he was sitting beside a man who didn't just dislike babies. He was sitting beside a man who needed control, and who would do something reckless the moment he lost it. That realization came too late for intervention, but just early enough to brace for what was coming. It was the kind of silence that only exists right before something breaks. Broden Vale's leg shot forward with a sudden jolt, the motion as quick as it was irrational. His heel struck the base of the infant carrier beside him, not with brutal force, but with enough snap to jar it off balance. The plastic shell thudded against the edge of Marvin Caldis's seat, shifting Laren's small body sharply to one side. The 8-month-old let out a high-pitched gasp before the silence of the cabin shattered under the weight of his first terrified cry. Marvin's arms moved before thought could catch up. Instinct, sharpened by fatherhood and years of practiced composure, propelled him into action. He seized the carrier with both hands, pulling it tight to his chest, his body shielding his son from further harm. His breath caught, not from pain, but from the shock of what had just happened. The surrounding rows froze. A gasp unfurled like a slow-motion wave. First a woman 3 seats back, then a young man with earbuds yanked half out, then a cluster of the passengers mid-conversation who stopped mid-word. Even the flight attendant, Taran Hest, turned with a look of disbelief, his hand still gripping the overhead storage latch. "Did he just?" someone muttered, barely audible. Liron wailed, a sound no one could ignore, high and aching and frightened. Broden leaned back in his seat, his jaw clenched but not with regret. Instead, his nostrils flared as if bracing for a confrontation. He pointed at the space near his shoes. "He was kicking into my footroom," he said loudly, defensively, as if the baby had done it intentionally. "You kicked my son's carrier," Marvin said, low and deliberate, his voice still tethered to control but now lined with unmistakable steel. His eyes didn't blink, didn't shift away. "I didn't kick him. He was moving too close. I barely nudged." "Barely?" Marvin's voice dropped in tone but rose in power. "You put your foot into my son's carrier." Taran moved quickly now, his training catching up to the reality unfolding. "Gentlemen, please," he said, raising a palm toward each man, though his gaze landed on Broden first. "Sir, did you just make contact with the child's seat?" Broden stood halfway, indignant. I said it was unintentional, but if a parent can't keep his child from squirming around— You didn't even touch the kid and now he's crying his head off, another voice interjected. It was Jarek Dorn, the quiet passenger in 5D who had, until now, kept to himself. But now, his phone was raised steadily in his right hand, screen glowing, red light blinking. I've been filming since you leaned forward. Everything's on this. Broden turned toward him, suddenly aware that he wasn't just in a tense disagreement, he was becoming the subject of multiple lenses, witnesses and opinions forming in real time. Marvin slowly rose to full height. Leiron still nestled protectively against him, the cries now turning into hiccuping sobs. The muscles in Marvin's jaw worked silently as he stared down Broden. He didn't shout, he didn't rush, but the force of his presence, measured, intelligent, and utterly unyielding, made the moment feel heavier than any raised voice could have. "You don't get to kick a child," Marvin said, words crisp as glass. "Not because you're frustrated, not because you feel crowded, not for any reason. Ever." Taran shifted slightly, stepping between the two. "Sir, please stay seated," he instructed Broden, though his tone lacked its earlier neutrality. "I am seated," Broden snapped, "and I'm being harassed now." "You caused this," said another male passenger from row 6. "We all saw it." The cabin had changed. What was once a neutral sea of strangers was now a court of silent observers, each one forming judgments, their postures angled ever so slightly away from Broden and toward the man holding his child with care. Broden gestured helplessly. He brought a baby on a crowded flight. What did he expect? Marvin's tone, when he replied, was quiet but razor-sharp. "I expected decency." Taran tapped his comm device and spoke in a low voice into the collar mic, likely notifying the cockpit. His eyes glanced down the aisle and then back at Broden. "This incident will be documented. Please refrain from further comment or movement." Jarek moved a step forward. "You just don't get it," he said to Broden. "You were so annoyed about a baby making noise, and now your actions made sure the whole cabin's staring at you." The irony landed like a stone in still water. Broden looked around. His eyes scanned the passengers, the ones whispering, the ones holding up phones, the ones staring with quiet condemnation. His mouth opened, then shut again. No defense came. Marvin sat back down slowly, never turning his back to Broden until he was settled. Leiron's hiccups softened, and Marvin whispered something into his hair, brushing the side of his head with care. Taran remained standing in the aisle for several moments, glancing between Broden, Marvin, and the rows around them. He didn't need training to understand what had just shifted. The roles of victim and aggressor had been burned into memory, visible, filmed, undeniable. And all of it, every beat of tension, every flicker of outrage, every judgmental silence had begun from one small, violent act. A single foot, a fraction of a second. And in that single, violent kick, the entire flight crossed a line that could never be undone. Broden's leg had just jolted forward, connecting sharply with the edge of the infant carrier strapped securely to Marvin's chest. The impact wasn't severe enough to knock Leiron out of place, but it rattled the baby enough to provoke a startled cry, sharp, frightened, and echoing louder than any sound previously heard in the cabin. Instinctively, Marvin's arms tightened around the carrier, shielding his son like a protective wall as his eyes narrowed, not in panic, but in absolute clarity. Taran Hest, the lead flight attendant, was already mid-row when he heard the cry and the sharp gasp that followed from multiple passengers. He turned swiftly and moved toward the source of the commotion, his eyes locking immediately onto Marvin, now standing upright, and Broden, still seated but flushed and visibly tense. "Sir, did you just kick the child?" Taran asked, halting between them with both hands raised, palms open in a practiced but urgent gesture of de-escalation. His voice was firm but restrained, and he kept his tone neutral. Too many flights had taught him that initial reactions were rarely the full story. Broden sat up straighter, his posture suddenly defensive. "What?" "No. The kid was kicking my foot. I just moved my leg," he said, his voice laced with irritation rather than remorse. His gaze darted around the cabin, as if seeking silent approval, but found none. Marvin's jaw clenched slightly, his voice low but unwavering. "You touched my child. That's not a misunderstanding. That's assault." A ripple of quiet moved through the rows as passengers began turning in their seats. One man near the window whispered to his seatmate. A woman 2 rows behind leaned forward, trying to catch a better look. But the most critical shift came from Jarek Dorn, seated across the aisle. Without a word, he rose, holding his phone above his head like a beacon. "I have everything recorded," Jarek announced. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried weight, measured, deliberate, meant for the entire cabin to hear. "I started filming 10 minutes ago. Got the whole thing." Broden turned sharply toward him, his face stiffening. "You were filming me?" "You kicked a baby," Jarek replied, his voice cool, unmoved. "That became everybody's business." Marvin didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Broden, but his mind was already moving. Every legal scenario, every piece of evidence, every possible outcome. He had seen enough boardroom crises to know when a moment needed precision over emotion. Taryn pressed the call button near the forward galley without turning around. A quiet chime echoed overhead. It was standard procedure. Cabin disturbance logged, cockpit notified. But the sound now felt like a gavel striking the beginning of something irreversible. Broden shifted again, and suddenly, in a moment of reckless panic, lunged across the aisle, reaching for Jarek's phone. The reaction was instinctual, not calculated, purely desperate. But he didn't get far. A man from row 5, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped into the narrow aisle just as Broden reached the edge of his seat. "Don't even think about it," the man said, holding one hand forward like a human barrier. Broden froze. The aisle had turned against him. For a moment, the cabin descended into chaos. Seatbelts clinked. Passengers murmured louder. A flight attendant from the rear moved forward quickly, but it all stabilized within seconds. The chaos didn't last. The judgment did. Marvin remained still, watching every detail, absorbing each expression, storing every reaction. He turned slightly and addressed a young man seated 2 rows back who had earlier been filming discreetly. "My wallet," Marvin said quietly, handing it over. "There's a business card inside. Please text the number and say it's urgent. Use my name." The man nodded. He didn't ask questions. Taryn exhaled slowly, his eyes moving across the crowded rows. He had handled unruly passengers before. He had seen tears, arguments, even screaming parents. But this wasn't any of those. This was something different, something that would not fade once the plane landed. "Mr. Vale," Taryn said, using Broden's name with careful weight. "I'm moving you. You'll be seated near the rear exit row, for everyone's comfort and safety." Broden tried to object, his mouth opening with protest, but no words came out. Every face he passed in the cabin bore the same silent message. You've lost this moment. Even those who had no children, no stake in the matter, turned cold. Quiet disapproval clung to every row like fog. Taryn guided Broden slowly down the aisle. Some passengers avoided looking at him. Others stared directly, unapologetic. A few took quiet photos, not for attention, but for accountability. Back near the front, Marvin sat again, gently rocking Laron, who had calmed but was still sniffling against his chest. The cabin wasn't loud anymore. It wasn't silent either. It was watchful, charged with something deeper than conflict, something bordering on collective reckoning. Taryn returned moments later, adjusting his collar as he passed Marvin. He didn't speak, but the look he gave was different now, less official, more human. and Broden Vale sat 3 rows from the emergency hatch, arms folded tightly, jaw set, eyes staring forward, no longer annoyed, but exposed. They moved him not just for safety, but because every row he passed had turned cold with quiet disapproval. Captain Joran Calden stepped into the cabin with a purpose sharpened by years of command experience, his boots making a dull thud on the carpeted aisle as passengers glanced up. His posture was composed, but his eyes flicked quickly toward row 3, where the incident had taken place. In his hand, a tablet glowed faintly, the paused video frame frozen on the exact moment Broden Vale's foot connected with the infant carrier. Taryn Hest stood to the side, rigid and tense, his brow furrowed with the weight of the situation he had just briefed the captain on. Neither man spoke at first. The silence inside the aircraft had shifted, less like a quiet flight and more like a courtroom awaiting judgment. Calden turned toward the intercom and, with practiced clarity, spoke into the receiver. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to inform you that a passenger-related incident has been reported and is under internal review. Federal aviation protocol is being followed. We ask that all passengers remain calm as we proceed through the next portion of the flight." He clicked off the mic. The cabin didn't erupt, but it stirred. Whispers passed quickly between seatmates as fingers hovered over phone screens. People weren't panicked. They were watching. Everyone knew what he hadn't said aloud. This wasn't just turbulence or delay. This flight had become a legal liability. Broden Vale sat alone now, his knees tightly together, arms rigid at his sides, gaze fixed on the seatback screen ahead of him, though it played nothing. His expression was not one of regret, but confusion, a man stunned by the rapid unspooling of events he could no longer control. The quiet cabin had turned into something unrecognizable to him. Where there had once been indifference to his presence, there was now something worse: awareness. Further forward, in row 3, Marvin Caldas eased back into his seat. His arms were wrapped around Laron, who had stopped crying but now let out soft hiccups, little gasps from a baby who didn't understand why the world had jolted around him. Marvin stroked the back of his son's head slowly, whispering into the downy curls. "You're safe now. You're safe." His voice was low, almost a breath, but resolute. He wasn't trying to calm the cabin. He was centering himself. Around him, the mood had changed. It wasn't tense in the usual sense. There was no shouting, no pushing, but something had cracked. The atmosphere had entered a state of reflection. 2 rows behind him, an elderly man leaned over the aisle gently. "You handled that with strength," he whispered, voice gravelly with age but steady. "More than most would." Marvin gave him a nod, nothing more. He wasn't here for praise. His mind was moving swiftly now, not toward confrontation, but preparation. He adjusted Laron's blanket, keeping his hands steady, and reached into the compartment below his seat. From inside, he withdrew a slim, red-lined portfolio, its leather edges worn from years of quiet use. Embossed in fine gold font near the seam was the name of his legal team, Valine and Corin, LLP. The move was not dramatic, but deliberate. Passengers who noticed the folder exchanged subtle glances. One whispered, "He's not just some father," and the phrase repeated like an undercurrent. Jarek Dorn, seated 1 row forward, slid beside him with quiet tact. "I backed it all up," he murmured without preamble. "Cloud and offline." His hand rested briefly on the seat in front of him, as though passing a silent baton in a relay neither had planned to run. Marvin looked at him, not with surprise but with understanding. "Thank you," he said, his tone crisp, the kind used in boardrooms and negotiation tables. It wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Taryn passed by the row again, moving slowly this time. He hesitated as he caught sight of the red portfolio resting open on Marvin's lap. He opened his mouth slightly, perhaps to offer something, an apology or a formal statement, but he couldn't find the words. Marvin glanced up at him and gave a nod. It wasn't permission. It was clarity. "I see you, and I see the game you're in." Taran walked on without speaking. In the seat behind Broden, two passengers who hadn't interacted for the entire flight now leaned toward each other. "Did you see how he just pulled out a legal kit?" "Yeah. And did you notice the folder's label? He's not playing checkers." Their quiet words were the ripple. What Broden had started with a single kick had evolved beyond his understanding. It wasn't just about a cry disrupting his comfort. It had become a symbol, a question of restraint, violence, and power. Back at the front of the cabin, Marvin tapped the tablet on the seatback screen gently, pulling up a secured messaging interface reserved for business-class encrypted communications. It was a courtesy feature few passengers ever used. He did. He typed swiftly, "Incident occurred. Flag it. Begin litigation prep. Secure evidence chain. Apply brand protocol tier 3. Caldas out." He hit send. The packet was transmitted before the next passenger finished their breath. Captain Calden returned to the cockpit, but not before pulling Taran aside near the galley. His voice was hushed, but firm. "Status. Passenger Vale is stable. No further movement. But the mood's shifted entirely. Cabins with Caldas." Calden inhaled slowly through his nose and exhaled as though steadying a ship against invisible winds. "Start contingency prep. If anything escalates, we divert. This isn't a transport flight anymore. It's an event." Taran nodded. "Understood." Calden paused, then added quietly, "And every event creates consequences." The father was no longer defending. He was preparing. Broden Vale stared forward, his arms folded so tightly across his chest they almost trembled. The air inside the cabin had thinned, not physically but socially, like every eye had taken a step back from him without needing to move. His breathing was shallow now. He couldn't hear the engines or the murmur of idle conversations anymore. All he could hear was the sharp echo of his own thoughts slamming into the walls of memory, the impact of his shoe against the infant's carrier, the horrified gasps, the camera pointed in his direction, and Marvin Caldas. Silent, steady, unreadable. The man hadn't shouted, hadn't lunged, hadn't cursed. That's what unsettled Broden the most. The restraint. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat near the emergency row where he had been relocated, no longer for convenience, but containment. His palms were damp against the vinyl armrests. From a few rows up, he could still see Marvin in profile, rocking the baby gently, his hand rhythmically patting Liron's back like a metronome ticking down to something inevitable. Marvin wasn't looking back at him. He didn't need to. His silence radiated control. Worse, purpose. Broden wiped his hands on his jeans and leaned forward, elbows on knees, trying to breathe deeper. But all he could think about was how a kick, one impulsive, childish kick, had unraveled everything. And how this man, this father, hadn't even raised his voice. That kind of quiet scared him more than yelling ever could. At the front of the plane, Marvin tapped quietly on the in-seat interface, accessing the aircraft's encrypted satellite line reserved for business-class executive use. His fingers moved with precision, not haste. The message he drafted to his office was brief and surgical. "Incident occurred. Flag for legal team. Prepare public holding language per equity framework. Contact Valen and Corin LLP. Log timestamp 14:23 UTC. Begin footage sweep and incident mapping." He reread it once, then sent. The hum of the cabin resumed faintly in the background, the clink of a plastic cup, the shuffle of someone retrieving a blanket. But everything around Marvin had shifted. Jarek Dorn sat 2 seats away, having subtly repositioned himself after sharing a knowing glance. The camera in his lap was still rolling, though hidden beneath a magazine. The footage had already been backed up to the cloud the moment the kick happened. Marvin knew it. Jarek had whispered it while passing him a water bottle earlier. Got it. Clean. Time-stamped. Synced. Marvin nodded then, but now his mind was ahead, several moves ahead. Back in the cockpit, Captain Joran Calden reviewed a short report from Terran Hest on his tablet. A still frame from the security feed showed the moment Broden's legs struck the carrier. Another frame captured the expressions of passengers around him: shock, disapproval, a woman clutching her coat like armor. Calden leaned over the console and spoke into a secure channel. "Status on passenger interaction? I need clarity." Terran's voice came through the comm. "Broden Vale is stable, sir, not speaking much. The cabin's vibe has shifted. Everyone's with Caldas now." Calden exhaled slowly. "Understood. Monitor. If he tries anything else, we move to Phase 2. I want a diversion route mapped within the next 10. If this goes any further, we land." Terran paused. "Copy that." Calden muted the channel and stared at the live cabin feed for a moment longer. What he saw wasn't panic or chaos. It was a kind of moral gravity, the kind that pulled people silently toward one man, and away from another. Back in row 3, Marvin's gaze flicked toward the seatback monitor, watching the real-time flight path. His mind wasn't on the altitude or the weather systems. It was calculating impact, legal, social, economic. Unknown to most on board, Marvin Caldas was not just a CEO. He was the lead designer of Airlon's ethical AI engine, which provided predictive behavioral modeling for the aviation industry's own passenger escalation systems. The irony that the aircraft they were flying on used software partially licensed by his own company had not escaped him, and that detail he knew would surface soon. But not yet. Every step had to be timed, every decision recorded, every outcome intentional. He leaned in toward Laron, whose soft breathing now steadied against his chest. "You're safe," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But he's not. Near the rear cabin door, Broden shifted again, agitated. His mind played the incident on loop, each time more damning. He had assaulted a baby. He had done it mid-air. He had done it under surveillance. He had done it to the one man on this plane he should never have underestimated. Captain Calden checked the ground-to-air comms again. No new disturbances. Yet. "Terran," he radioed softly. "Let's keep it quiet, but prepare the diversion plan if this escalates. The flight is no longer just transportation. It's now an event." He paused. "And every event creates consequences." The passenger smirked, certain his attack would go unchallenged, unaware that every witness, every camera, and every ounce of the CEO's restraint had already turned into controlled precision. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets strength, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Broden Vale's name flashed onto the crew tablet in bold red lettering: "Priority member, historical loyalty record. Proceed with caution." Terran Hest, the flight attendant, stood frozen in the galley, the screen's glow reflecting off the brushed steel behind him. His thumb hovered over the confirmation prompt as his eyes scanned the footnote beneath it, a buried complaint from 2022. Aggressive behavior reported by passenger. Status: archived without action. Terran's breath caught slightly. The sudden weight of hidden history made the already tense cabin feel more claustrophobic. He locked the screen and turned, glancing down the aisle toward where Broden sat, shoulders hunched, fingers twitching subtly against the armrest. Captain Joran Calden had also been alerted. From the cockpit, he tapped into the back-end flight database and pulled up Broden's passenger history. The archived complaint included notes from a gate agent describing an incident eerily similar in tone, verbal outbursts toward a father traveling with a toddler. It had been filed, reviewed, and then quietly dismissed under insufficient escalation. Calden narrowed his eyes. He picked up the comm unit. "Ground control, this is Captain Calden. I need access to full incident logs involving a Broden Vale. Cross-check prior flagged entries, especially involving minor passengers. Repeat, cross-check, and secure files. Copy that, the voice returned. We'll begin pull-up and secure transfer. Expect update within 15 minutes. Back in the cabin, unaware that systems were working behind the scenes, Broden suddenly stood up, his movements tight and impatient. His voice didn't rise, he had learned that lesson, but his body language told a different story. He muttered something about needing the lavatory, brushing past a blanket hanging from an overhead bin. 3 passengers moved almost instinctively. One man reached into the bin, feigning confusion over a misplaced jacket. Another adjusted his seat and angled an elbow just wide enough to block the aisle. A third, seated just ahead, turned to his left as if checking his phone, conveniently stretching one leg across the path. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The cabin had drawn its own conclusions. Broden came to a halt, frustrated. "Excuse me," he said, louder now. His eyes darted around as he sensed the passive resistance. "I need to get through." Taran emerged from the galley like a stage cue, his voice even. "Sir, please return to your seat. I can assist you if needed." Broden's jaw tightened. "I just want to use the restroom." "I understand," Taran replied, stepping closer. "But due to earlier events, we're asking that you remain seated unless escorted by crew. It's for everyone's comfort and safety, including your own." Broden stood still, lips pressed into a thin line. The aisle lights hummed faintly beneath them, casting sharp shadows across his shoes. After a beat, he turned and walked back to his seat, slower this time. Every row he passed watched him in silence. There were no whispered judgments, no stifled giggles, just a quiet, impenetrable wall of disapproval. Taran followed closely, but not too close, measured steps, calm hands. "Please understand," he said in a low tone. "Any further attempt to move without clearance will result in formal restraint. That's not my preference, but it is policy." Broden sat down, seething. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence screamed frustration. Rows ahead, Marvin Caldas remained seated. Laron now nestled peacefully in the carrier, a single hand resting against his father's chest. Marvin's gaze had never left the reflective metal of the window beside him, but his mind was anything but passive. His expression appeared neutral to others, but behind it, a storm of calculation unfolded with quiet precision. He opened his slim black folio, retrieved a small notepad, and wrote a single sentence. "Mid-air assault. Escalated without provocation. Confirm violation of Federal Passenger Protection Clause, Section 7.3. Then, beneath it, he added, "Cross-reference with internal database. Priority flag versus child incident." The pad was slid back into a hidden compartment behind the seat tray. Beside him, Jarek Dorn leaned in slightly. "You saw Taran's face, right?" he whispered. "That guy's name triggered something. They didn't expect it." "I know," Marvin replied softly, his voice almost mechanical in calmness. "And they didn't expect me, either." He looked down at his son. "You're not a disruption," he whispered gently to Laron, who blinked up at him sleepily. "You're the reason we shift the center of gravity in rooms like these." Moments later, Captain Calden received the updated transmission from ground control. He reviewed it in silence. 2 prior incidents involving Broden Vale. Both non-criminal, both quietly dismissed, both involving infants or toddlers. Both times, Broden had argued lack of courtesy or disruptive behavior from negligent parents. Both times he had used enough of the right language to avoid crossing the disciplinary threshold, but the pattern was now undeniable. Calden's voice was level over the intercom when he spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we continue toward our scheduled descent, I want to thank you for your cooperation and patience during this flight. As always, the comfort and safety of every passenger is our top priority." He didn't mention Broden. He didn't need to. His message was for the cabin, and for the record. Back in his seat, Marvin had already begun drafting a timeline of events. Every minute was labeled, every quote was sourced. This wasn't retaliation, it was preparation. He wasn't here to punish Broden Vale. He was here to ensure that next time someone like Broden didn't get to hide behind priority status, buried complaints, or casual cruelty. This was bigger than one flight, bigger than one incident. It was about setting a standard. He leaned close to his son again, pressing a soft kiss to Laurent's forehead. His voice, barely a whisper, still carried the strength of something larger than any airline or legal system. What started as an act of cruelty would now become a turning point, because this time the father had resources, resolve, and the whole cabin watching. The wheels began to lower beneath the fuselage, and the shift in altitude was nearly imperceptible, except to those attuned to tension. Jarek Dorn leaned over without speaking and handed Dr. Marvin Caldas a slim, metallic flash key. The moment was silent, deliberate. Marvin accepted the drive without a word, slipping it into the inside pocket of his coat just beneath where Laurent now slept, nestled against his chest. There was no need for conversation. Everything had already been said with actions. The cabin had entered a strange kind of hush, a collective pause in judgment, as if the atmosphere itself awaited the moment the plane would touch down and decide what came next. Broden Vale, seated alone and surrounded by cold space in row 22, gripped the plastic edge of his tray table with whitening knuckles. Isolation pressed in from all sides. He wasn't cuffed, wasn't bound, but something worse had overtaken him. Social exile. A few rows ahead, a man turned slightly to glance back at him, not with curiosity, but with wordless disgust. That glance and the lack of any defense from the crew said everything. Broden turned to Taryn Hest, who stood a few paces away near the galley curtain, and raised his hand slowly like a scolded schoolboy. "I'd like to speak to the captain," he muttered, voice taut, barely concealing the desperation behind it. Taryn didn't flinch. "That won't be possible, sir. Protocol restricts cockpit access in flight." Broden's expression twisted. "Then give me a statement form. I have the right to document my version before this lands." Taryn reached into the overhead pouch and retrieved a blank incident card, standard issue, impersonal, and handed it over without commentary. The words printed at the top read, "All reports will be submitted to central arbitration." It was bureaucratic language designed to say very little, but in this moment it spoke volumes. The airline wasn't backing him. They weren't defending him. They were stepping away. Back near the front, Marvin adjusted the carrier strap slightly, mindful of Laurent's breathing. His son stirred gently but remained asleep, protected by the soft hum of the aircraft and the rising wall of support from the silent witnesses around them. Jarek sat beside him, scrolling quietly on his device. A few rows back, another passenger was sending a direct message to a friend. This flight turned into a courtroom. The baby's dad, calm as stone. The guy who kicked him, melting down. Marvin's mind didn't wander to anger. It wandered to precedent. How many other parents, particularly black fathers, had endured aggression in public only to be treated like the aggressor themselves? He wasn't just protecting Laurent anymore. He was documenting, preparing, ensuring that this event would not become another silent statistic buried under airline red tape. The plane leveled off in final approach, and a soft chime signaled the descent. Captain Calden's voice came over the intercom, smooth but weighted. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for arrival. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. For those concerned about an earlier cabin incident, please know all relevant reports are being submitted to our internal safety office. We thank you for your cooperation." That last line wasn't just for comfort. It was a quiet message to Marvin, to Broden, to everyone. The airline knew. Inside the cockpit, Calden gave a brief glance to his co-pilot. "He stays seated until security gets here. Move Caldas ahead of the crowd. Quiet exit, side stairs. Make sure Taryn handles it." The co-pilot nodded and relayed the plan. Back in the cabin, Taryn approached Marvin with the subtle discretion of someone handling a delicate handoff. He leaned down slightly and spoke in a low tone. "Mr. Caldas, the captain would like to offer you and your son the option to deplane first, using the forward stairway. It's quieter, no press, no chaos." Marvin gave a single nod. "Thank you." The final bump of landing rattled the cabin lightly, and the brakes hissed as the plane coasted to the gate. Passengers remained seated, not out of obedience but out of respect. Everyone sensed the need for order. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, Taryn stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated momentarily. A priority guest will be deplaning through the forward service stairwell." The curtain was pulled aside. Marvin stood carefully, his coat wrapped around Laron's carrier like a shield. Every move was precise, intentional. The aisle lights caught his profile as he stepped forward, head high, eyes focused, no need for retaliation. His power came from presence. He passed row after row, and men nodded, quietly acknowledging what had just happened. Not just a conflict, but a reversal. The one who kicked was now frozen in place. The one who had been kicked, his son, his name, his dignity, was rising above it. Broden turned to look, expecting perhaps a last glare, a last word. But Marvin didn't even glance his way. That indifference cut sharper than confrontation. Jarek lifted his phone again, not to record, but to capture the quiet moment of justice walking out. As Marvin descended the narrow metal stairway to the tarmac, the sunlight hit his face. The co-pilot waited at the base and simply said, "We'll file everything. Thank you, sir." Inside the cabin, Taryn clicked on his comm headset and spoke quietly. "Caldas has exited. Passenger Vale to remain seated." And just like that, roles reversed. The attacker restrained, the protector honored, the plane forever marked by what had happened in row 3. By the time the seatbelt light dimmed, Broden Vale had been sentenced, not by court, but by consequence. Marvin's shoes struck the tarmac with calm finality, the cool concrete beneath him a stark contrast to the heat simmering behind his steady eyes. The door of the aircraft closed behind him with a pneumatic hiss, cutting off the murmurs still swirling inside the cabin. Within seconds, 2 airline executives approached from the shadow of a waiting transport cart, one tall and lean, holding a sleek black folder stamped with the airline's emblem, the other shorter, his jacket unbuttoned and a practiced smile already softening his features. Neither man introduced himself. The taller one extended the folder without preamble. "This contains the official flight report and the preliminary witness logs," he said, his voice clipped, rehearsed. The shorter executive stepped forward with a measured nod. "Dr. Caldas, we'd appreciate a moment to walk you through a brief customer experience debrief." Marvin didn't take either. His hands remained gently wrapped around the sleeping form of Laron, still nestled against his chest. His voice, when it came, was quiet but unshakable. "Are you aware that the man you allowed to board, Broden Vale, has a prior assault record involving another passenger?" The executives froze, the performance slipping. For a moment, silence pooled between them. Then the shorter man tried to recover, adjusting his lapel as if it could shield him. That would be under security archives. We weren't." "I was," Marvin interrupted, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a matte gray data stick and held it up, not offering it, just displaying it. "This contains the full footage from the incident, time-coded, backed by passenger testimony, and stored redundantly on 3 legal servers. It includes the moment your crew was warned, the moment Vale struck my son's carrier, and the moment your system flagged his loyalty record after the damage was done." He let that statement hang. The taller executive swallowed and reached for the data stick, but Marvin lowered it. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here to make sure accountability isn't optional." With that, he stepped past them toward the transport shuttle, which had quietly pulled up to escort him to the terminal. Inside the airport, the atmosphere was no less tense. Broden Vale was escorted down the jet bridge several minutes after Marvin's exit. No handcuffs, no dramatic confrontation. Just two uniformed airport security officers walking a man whose shoulders slumped under the weight of collective disapproval. Several passengers who had deplaned earlier stood quietly near baggage claim, phones angled discreetly to capture the walk of shame. The footage wasn't violent, but it didn't need to be. Broden looked like a man undone by his own arrogance. A boy near the waiting area whispered to his father, "Is that the guy who kicked the baby?" The father only nodded. Online, events unfolded faster than expected. Jarek Dorn, now safely outside the aircraft, uploaded a short clip to social media under an anonymous handle. The caption read simply, "This is how not to treat a child or a father." The video showed the moment of the kick, the gasp of the cabin, and Marvin's steady, wordless rise to shield his son. No commentary, no sensationalism, just truth, framed in pixels. Within an hour, hashtags began to bloom: Flight 403 Incident, Protect Children Midair, and most virally, Marvin stayed calm. Comments poured in. "This man didn't yell once. That's leadership. He didn't threaten. He documented. This is what power looks like in a baby carrier." Back at the airline's press office, damage control went into effect. A hastily written statement appeared on their website acknowledging an unacceptable incident involving a passenger and commendable responses by others aboard. It was vague, clearly filtered through legal counsel, and yet it confirmed that the airline now knew it couldn't pretend this was isolated or minor. Broden's employer, Nelcor Trust, couldn't escape scrutiny either. A brief post appeared on their site within the same time window. "We are aware of an incident involving one of our employees and are conducting a formal internal review. Nelcor does not condone behavior that disrupts public safety or disrespects community values." But by then, it was too late. The narrative had escaped corporate spin. Marvin, meanwhile, said nothing publicly. Not yet. He left the terminal through a private corridor, Laron's tiny hand curled around his shirt. His phone buzzed, updates from his legal counsel, responses from senior partners at Vallon and Corin, incoming media inquiries. He answered none of them. Instead, he walked slowly toward the waiting town car and secured Laron's car seat before settling in. The city rolled past the window, unaware that a national conversation was now beginning in silent frames. In a quiet hotel room later that night, his legal team gathered. Screens flickered with news headlines, mentions on talk shows, speculative anchors. But Marvin's focus remained on Laron, now asleep beside him. He scrolled once more through the footage, not to relive it, but to remind himself how quickly a moment of violence could define a lifetime. He spoke only once to his team that evening. "We won't make this about vengeance," he said. "We'll make it about what's right." And as the headlines gained momentum and the airline scrambled to contain the fallout, Marvin Caldis remained poised in silence. The world waited to hear from him, but he waited on purpose, choosing his words with care, preparing not as a CEO, but as a father. Because when you speak as a father, not just a CEO, every word has power. The statement dropped like a stone into still water. No child should be harmed in the name of personal comfort, and no parent should be forced to justify their child's existence in a public space. Marvin Caldis didn't speak the words aloud. He simply released them, digitally, through an official press bulletin crafted with surgical precision by his legal counsel. There was no photograph, no video, no dramatic thumbnail to stoke outrage, just text, just clarity, just conviction. And yet, the internet ignited. Within minutes, the post traveled across networks, first on aviation safety boards, then through parenting communities, and finally into mainstream conversation. What stood out wasn't the rage, but the reverence. The restraint in Marvin's words struck a chord deeper than anger. He hadn't attacked. He hadn't accused. He had simply drawn a line in the sand and dared society to consider what lay on either side. In a glass-walled office on the 23rd floor of Airlon Systems Equity Division, Marvin sat still, watching the spread. Beside him, his legal strategist, Devin Core, exhaled quietly. "This will echo longer than we thought," Devin muttered, tapping his screen as the first wave of industry responses rolled in. "It has to," Marvin replied, adjusting Laron's tiny blue sock that had begun to slip. "If it doesn't echo now, the silence later will be dangerous." What neither of them anticipated was the next twist, delivered 2 days later in the form of an encrypted file from an anonymous address titled Flight 44, Suppressed Passenger Complaints. Devin scanned the file first, jaw tightening as he read the internal memos from 2022. Broden Vale filed 4 formal complaints against passengers with infants. One of them included language about reclaiming adult space. All marked as resolved, none escalated. Marvin stood slowly, his reflection in the window now sharper, as if the glass itself had decided to listen. "Patterns," he said, "and someone in that airline helped bury them." Devin nodded. "We have a precedent now. The narrative just shifted from one incident to a policy failure." With swift precision, Marvin's team drafted a federal proposal, the Laron Declaration, a document centered on in-air child protection, outlining rules for passenger conduct, swift crew intervention, digital reporting, and a no-tolerance clause for violence directed at children. It wasn't just legalese, it was personal. By the time it reached legislative inboxes, the memo had signatures from pediatric specialists, aviation risk assessors, and even a retired pilot who'd once been sued for defending a crying child mid-flight. Hearings were requested within 72 hours. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the airline, pressured by mounting media scrutiny and a quiet investor alert triggered by Marvin's brand team, sent a private message to Marvin's legal counsel. The offer, a closed-door executive meeting, public apology, and a chance to co-develop future policy. Marvin's reply was clear. Only if Broden Vale issues a written apology and agrees to court-mandated child sensitivity training. The airline stalled. Broden refused. For nearly a week, nothing moved. Then came the pressure from Nelcor Trust's board, the firm where Broden was still employed. Their inboxes were flooded. Their partners were nervous. A quiet leak suggested several key clients had inquired about internal ethics alignment. Suddenly, Broden folded. The statement arrived at 2:13 a.m., brief and strained. "I deeply regret my actions aboard the flight and acknowledge that I caused harm. No child deserves to be placed in danger. I accept the consequences and the responsibility to better understand my behavior." It wasn't poetic, it wasn't sweeping, but it was on paper, and it bore his name. Marvin read it once, then again, then placed it down and lifted Laron from his crib with care. He didn't gloat, he didn't broadcast it, but somewhere deep in the quiet of his chest, a knot had finally started to loosen. Outside, headlines were already spinning. From kick to consequence, new father-led reform gains national attention. CEO breaks silence, starts movement without raising voice. Vale apologizes in wake of Laron Declaration rollout. And amidst the flurry of takes, reposts, and analyst breakdowns, one comment surfaced repeatedly from viewers, bloggers, and leaders alike. He stayed calm, and still moved the world. Marvin returned to his office, the statement printed and filed beneath a folder marked Federal Reforms. He leaned back in his chair, gazing at the ceiling, not in relief, but in reflection. Because winning wasn't the end. It was just the moment before you begin again. With eyes wider, shoulders steadier, and the burden of quiet leadership resting fully on your frame. And just like that, the man who kicked in silence was now being quoted an apology before a national audience. The footage hit the cloud before the wheels touched the ground. Within 72 hours of the incident, The airline's internal compliance board scrambled to control narrative damage. Yet they were already behind. Marvin Caldis's silence, more than any press release, amplified speculation. The video, now circulating in quiet corners of professional networks and advocacy forums, didn't rely on commentary. It simply showed a sharp kick, a stunned baby, and a father's calm that unnerved even those who had watched the event unfold. But that wasn't the story's conclusion. It was the ignition. As word spread, airlines across the industry felt a shift. Protocol review boards were convened hastily. Memos were drafted, many using the same term that kept appearing in meeting rooms and digital briefs, the Caldis Clause. Though unofficial, it embodied a single, potent idea that protecting children in transit must no longer depend on the decency of strangers or the patience of parents. Meanwhile, back at Airlon Systems headquarters, Marvin returned to his routine, but with one noticeable difference. On the day of the Aviation Ethics Roundtable, he entered the studio not alone, but with LaRon perched calmly in a compact booster seat beside him. The cameras panned. The host paused. No statement was needed. The image itself, a father and child, both calm, both present, spoke volumes. Viewers who didn't know the story Googled it immediately. Those who did leaned in with respect. "Mr. Caldis," one panelist asked during the broadcast, "do you believe accountability should begin with legislation or with leadership?" Marvin glanced at LaRon, then back at the moderator. "Neither," he said. "It begins with how we respond when we think no one's watching." The room fell silent, and the shift continued. Back at Nelcor Trust, Broden Vale's employer, a quiet tremor had begun to crack the surface. The incident report, now public, forced the board to initiate a deeper compliance review, not just of Broden's behavior, but of his expense records and client conduct. The findings were damning. Not only had Broden violated multiple internal protocols, but he had also manipulated client allocations for months. The board had a choice: defend him and risk collapse, or sever the tie. They chose the latter. Broden Vale was terminated by unanimous vote, his profile erased from the firm's internal directory less than 2 weeks after the flight. The company released a carefully worded statement citing a violation of ethical standards unrelated to the travel incident. But no one bought the phrasing. They knew what started it. The man who kicked a child had kicked open a vault of wider rot. When news reached Marvin, he paused only briefly before returning to his work. There was no victory in a man's downfall, only a necessary correction. Taryn Hest, the flight attendant who had separated the two men midair, reached out personally. His voice trembled slightly during the call. "I just wanted to say thank you," Taryn said. "Most people would have shouted, caused a scene. You didn't. And watching that, I realized I've got to change how I handle pressure." Marvin listened, then replied with quiet clarity. "Sometimes restraint does more than resistance, especially when a child's watching." The commendation from Captain Calden arrived days later, a letter printed on crisp linen paper, signed in blue ink, and hand-delivered to Marvin's office. It read, in part, "Your composure under extreme emotional duress reminded this crew what leadership looks like in its quietest form." The story, once a moment of conflict, had evolved into something larger, a litmus test for how society treated its smallest travelers and the parents who protected them. Yet, even as the headlines swirled and networks debated airline policy, Marvin remained centered. He filed no lawsuits. He issued no press rants. He allowed the system to expose itself, letting truth work like gravity, quiet, slow, but inevitable. Industry insiders whispered of a pending federal reform, a proposed standard to codify the incident's lessons. Some already called it by name. Others used its proposed title, the LaRon Declaration. And through it all, LaRon sat beside his father, smiling at microphones, curious about ceiling lights, blissfully unaware of the firestorm he had unknowingly survived. The tale had begun with a sudden, senseless kick, but what it built was something no one expected. A flight that started with pain ended with purpose. A father's restraint became a nation's reflection, and a baby's soft cry awakened a system long overdue for change. And it all began in silence, shattered by a foot, but rebuilt by resolve. Months passed. The incident aboard Flight 303 gradually slipped from trending headlines, replaced by newer controversies and distractions, but its echo remained embedded in quieter places: legal memos, flight attendant training slides, boardroom agendas, and hearts of those who had witnessed what restraint could look like when tested. It was not a story retold with outrage or noise anymore. It had become something quieter, heavier. A new plaque appeared one day in Terminal C of Heronport Airport near Gate 32, where it all began. No unveiling ceremony, no cameras, just a rectangle of brushed steel embedded into the wall beside a viewing window that overlooked the runways. The engraving read, "In honor of those who remain calm when others do not, in defense of the vulnerable, in protection of the future." No name followed, but everyone who had been on that flight, and most who had read about it, knew exactly who it honored. Marvin Caldas visited on a Sunday. He arrived without his usual security or aides, wearing a plain gray jacket and pushing a black stroller. His son, Leron, now older and more curious, pointed at passing carts and airplanes with wide-eyed wonder. The terminal wasn't crowded, but a few airport workers noticed him. None interrupted. He stopped beside the plaque, reading it slowly as if seeing the words for the first time, even though he had approved the draft months earlier. He said nothing aloud, but the way his hand rested on the stroller bar, tightened briefly, then relaxed, suggested a silent memory had surfaced. A young boy nearby noticed the plaque, too. He tugged on his father's coat and asked, "What does that mean?" The father looked at the words, hesitated, then replied softly, "It means someone stood up the right way." Marvin heard it. He looked at the man just for a second and nodded once. The man nodded back. Back at Airlon Systems, the echoes of that flight had transformed into policy. Marvin had launched an internal reform program known as LROW, short for Leron's Right of Way. It offered family transit stipends, emergency leave for parents, and training sessions for all staff on managing public confrontation with dignity and strategy rather than instinct. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. Quietly, other tech firms began asking to license Airlon's framework, especially after it was mentioned in a televised panel on corporate empathy and resilience. Notably, the airlines listened too. After all, their cabin had been the stage, and their silence during that first week had cost them dearly. Industry murmurs continued, always about the CEO who stayed calm when others would have snapped. Marvin heard them, but he never repeated the story himself. Not in public. He never described the moment Brodenvale's foot struck his son's carrier. He didn't need to. That image lived in the minds of millions now, not because of the violence, but because of the reaction that followed it. Broden had vanished from public view, but not from consequence. As part of his court-ordered reform agreement, he was relocated to a new city and enrolled in community rehabilitation programs focused on emotional control, parental empathy, and racial bias awareness. There were no cameras tracking his progress, only weekly logs submitted anonymously to a review board. Whether he had changed fully, no one could say. But for the first time, Brodenvale was listening, not reacting, and that alone suggested something had shifted. Meanwhile, Marvin received invitations from advocacy groups, ethics panels, legal summits, but declined most. One exception was a private leadership forum on ethical responsibility in corporate power. The invitation had come quietly, signed by panelists who had been on Flight 303. Marvin accepted. The conference hall was modest but full, mostly CEOs, a few professors and legal scholars. Marvin stood at the center of the panel, his son seated just off stage with a book and a juice box. No fanfare, no dramatic video, just Marvin in a charcoal blazer speaking into the silence. He didn't start with the flight. He started with a principle. "We often talk about power as action," he said, "but restraint is also power, sometimes greater." He described soft power not as avoidance but as control forged in heat. He explained how leadership isn't defined by how you strike back, but how you redirect. How staying seated, when every nerve demands you rise, can reshape the narrative. The room was still. He ended with one line. "There are many ways to take flight, but some of the highest ones begin with staying seated and doing what's right. Because some emergencies don't need oxygen masks, they need restraint." Seconds later, the father acted with calm force, and the smirking passenger found himself pinned, isolated, and escorted to an emergency seat as the crew froze in shock. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with discipline, clarity, and unstoppable power, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores prejudice, abuse of authority, and the courage it takes to stand up for loved ones. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and protecting the vulnerable.